The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save over $700 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates national annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary.
I just casually looked towards the canal and I saw what I thought was a mannequin.
August 2nd, 1998, the body of a brilliant young scientist is found dead near the campus of Georgetown University. It was a gruesome scene.
Walking up to the body, it became apparent that there had been a sexual assault.
For more than 6 years, D.C. police had no leads and no suspects. Then, another disturbing discovery. She wasn't his only victim.
As these cases went on, the more the victims resisted, the more violent he became.
One man committing a series of heinous crimes against women, but then he just stops. 10 years go by, then 20. What would it take to finally crack the case wide open? I'm Paul Wagner. Join me for Unknown Subject, Season 3 of WTOP's American Nightmare podcast series, available October 4th on all podcast platforms.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, it's a story so bizarre only Hollywood could make it. A couple adopts a little girl, only to discover she's a grown woman with homicidal tendencies. But did it really happen? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my outmontand co-host, Alice.
Wow, Brett, that was very convincing. Was that German?
It's Dutch, so close.
Dutch.
Wow. It means excellent. We have Ka to thank for that, so thank you to her.
Thank you, Ka. I was just impressed with how you pronounced it. I mean, I don't speak Dutch, but it sounded very convincing.
I may have listened to it a few times online and probably still got it wrong, but that's okay. It's okay.
That's awesome.
I did my best. I tried hard, and it's the thought that counts. It's the effort that matters.
There is a lot of effort. Now that we have our other podcast, Legal Briefs, and I have to introduce you, I can say it's a lot of pressure.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's like that whole man in the arena speech, right? Until you've been the man in the arena, it's easy to criticize. But then when you have to introduce somebody, you're like, oh, man, this is a lot harder than I thought. So.
You're the one with the sweat and the blood on your face, right?
Welcome to the arena.
Welcome to the arena of words.
Of words. Which words are important when you're doing a podcast, unfortunately.
Words are important in the practice of law and podcasting. Very accurate. Can you tell that I'm trying to stall because it's the month of October? I do love you, which is why I do these creepy shows in October. But the entire month of October, I swear, I am just constantly looking over my shoulder because I think someone's going to scare me. And they usually do.
You know, Alice, it's funny that I've managed to convince you that the other 11 months of true crime coverage that we do is not creepy and scary because we're constantly talking about horrific, horrible, terrifying things that are happening in real life. But when we add the sort of fictional element, that's when it starts to scare you.
You make a really good point. I never thought about it that way. So this weekend, I got to see some friends who are wonderful friends because they listen to our podcast, but we don't live close to them, and their kids listen to the podcast, and they're pretty young. Shout out to Jack and Scarlett. And they love it, and they talk about blood splatter and know all the intricacies of murders. And I think that's so cool, but also I definitely didn't know all those things at their ages.
I'm happy that so many of you let your kids listen to this show, but I am a little surprised. I admit.
I'm not questioning your parenting. I'm just saying, like,
No,
kudos.
and we want all the listeners that we can get. I mean, we're gonna have to start advertising for like children's toys or something if we've got so many children listening to the show. But you know, it's just one of those things where people will say to us, "Well, our kids can listen to the show because you guys, it's a clean podcast. We don't have to worry about any, you know, dirty language or whatever." And I'm like, "Well, that's true."
There's no dirty language as we talk about brutal murders.
But hey, it's a brutal world out there. You got to prepare them. So this is as good a way as any.
Now, some of you, see, here's the thing. Those of you who complain about our banter, I think you're not listening close enough, because if you listen closely enough, you'll realize that all our banter actually is tangentially related to the story we're talking about, because this is all very, very relevant to the creepy story we're going to delve into today about what children know, don't know, should not know, and whether they're children at all.
Oh, I love your segues, Alice. They're amazing. They're amazing. And Alice is 100% right. Today we have a story that really does raise some questions about what it means to be a child. And I think we have to start with 2009 when Dark Castle Entertainment released The Orphan to little fanfare and mixed reviews. But when audiences got a hold of the film and its shocking twist, they loved it. Isabel Furman played Esther, a 9-year-old girl adopted by a couple, played by Vera Farmiga and Peter Sarsgaard. But it isn't long till the mother, Kate, comes to suspect that there is more to Esther than meets the eye. And the whole thing plays out with dark humor and fantastic performances by everyone involved, but in particular, Furman. But what if I told you that this outlandish story might just be more than Hollywood fiction, and that the real story has twists so unbelievable that no producer would ever put them on the screen? And that brings us to the story we are going to discuss today, that of Natalia Grace Barnett.
All right, guys, hold your horses, because this is a story that will make the hairs on your neck rise up. In May 2010, Christine and Michael Barnett decided to adopt a 6-year-old girl from a Florida adoption agency. Christine and Michael weren't new to parenthood. Their son, Jake Barnett, had been a child prodigy, so much so, in fact, that he was featured on the show 60 Minutes. Jake was the youngest student ever at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics and is currently a quantum physicist. His mother wrote a book about raising him called The Spark, A Mother's Story of Nurturing Genius. And if anyone was ready to take on a new child, it would seem to have been the Barnetts. In 2010, they decided to do just that. You see, the Barnetts had long fostered children in their Indiana home, and so it seemed natural that when they decided it was time to expand their family, they wanted to do it in a way that would help someone. When they heard about Natalia, they decided they wanted to make her a part of their family. She suffered from a severe form of dwarfism known as spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. The family welcomed Natalia to join their family that already included 3 sons. It seemed like this would be the perfect situation for everyone, but it wasn't long before Christine began to notice something that alarmed her. Christine gave Natalia a bath, as many parents do. And remember, Natalia was just a 6-year-old who suffered from severe dwarfism and was new to this country. But during this bath, Christine was shocked to discover that Natalia, supposedly 6, had pubic hair. She was even more shocked when Natalia had her period. Christine tried to push it aside, chalk it up to something she couldn't explain, but soon things got much stranger.
And this is one of those things, you hear this story and your immediate thought is probably, Number one, this does sound like a movie. And number two, there's no way any of this happened. This is totally an urban legend. And originally, when this story first started sort of floating through the internet and people started hearing about it, the thought was this was some sort of urban legend. And even as we started to put this together, I thought, are we going to look into this and realize that this didn't really happen? But in reality, this is exactly what Christine says happened to her family, that she's a loving mother. She has 3 boys. She's always wanted a girl, but she's having trouble with pregnancy. Her pregnancies had been really hard, both on her and her children. And everyone sort of agreed, you don't need to have any more children in the natural way. But they loved kids and they wanted to have a little girl. And this was the perfect opportunity because it wasn't just, we're going to adopt a girl, but we're going to adopt a girl who has this disability, these difficulties, things that a lot of times, unfortunately, makes it difficult for an adoption to occur. Kids who have problems like this, there's a lot of people who either aren't equipped or just don't want to deal with that. But this was something they wanted to do, and this was going to be the perfect completion of their family. And then they bring her in, and these things start to happen that make them wonder, did we get the full story? Is this the person that we thought she was? And like Alice said, at first they kind of pushed it aside. They tried not to make too big a deal of it. Obviously, there's a little bit of indeterminacy here, right? This is an adoption from a foreign country. There are probably some things about Natalia that may not be entirely accurate. It wouldn't be surprising, for instance, if her exact birth date was not known, and even if she was a couple years older or younger than what she was listed at. Obviously, Natalia can't tell anybody when she was born. She wouldn't know. And to some extent, a couple years here or there when your child's 8 or 9 might not make as much of a difference, particularly when they already have a developmental issue such as this severe form of dwarfism. You could imagine that they're either look older or younger than they are. So if it were just the case that maybe we're off by a couple years here, it probably wouldn't be that big a deal. But over the next 2 years, it becomes obvious to Christine that something is going on here that is more than just maybe the age isn't quite right. And she becomes more and more convinced that her adopted daughter, it's not just that she's not who the adoption agency claimed her to be, and it's not just that there's some mystery about the exact details of her life and where she came from. She's starting to think that her daughter herself is the person who is perpetrating some sort of fraud on them, that is telling them some sort of lie. And instead of a 6-year-old little girl, Christine becomes more and more convinced that her daughter may be in her teens and maybe even in her 20s. And worse still, she becomes convinced that there is some sort of mental issue here that is deep-seated and is dangerous. And look, Natalia is not hiding it if this is true. According to Christine, Natalia would draw pictures of the family, which is not unusual for children, but in these pictures, everyone would be dead. And in fact, Natalia would tell Christine that she wanted to murder all of them. The parents, the 2 boys, that she wanted to roll them up in a blanket and bury them in the backyard. Now, Alice, you talk about creepy. It is hard for me to imagine anything more creepy than that.
Especially coming from a 6-year-old. I have an almost 5-year-old, and I don't think he's even capable of kind of dreaming up something this dark. And so to hear, these really dark words coming from a supposedly, young child is very disconcerting, especially when it's so specific and something that is plausible. This is not fantastical. It's not a dreamland. You really can, and people do murder and bury people in their backyards.
Now, I will say this. Children can be super creepy. And there are plenty of examples of that. You can find lots of great top 10 creepiest things kids ever said to their parents list online. So they can say creepy things, These are pretty detailed. Like Alice said, this is not just, after you die, I'm going to paint the house or something. Like this is some very specific stuff, and it's backed up by action. So for instance, the boys were one of the focuses of Natalia's attempts to harm them, according to the family. Michael would say that, it's interesting because Natalia, she obviously has this sort of physical disability. So she's not physically intimidating, and it's going to be difficult for her to actually harm anyone. So according to the family, she was actually pretty clever in the way she would do these things. For instance, Michael would say the one thing she would do is she would find out what the boys' favorite toys were. She would get those toys, she would lead them to the road, and then she would throw the toys in the road. And the boys would run out into the road to get their toys and almost get hit by cars. So she was putting them in a situation where the problem might take care of itself, because she obviously can't do anything about it. She also, on occasion, according to Christine said that she would walk in on Natalia pouring bleach and other cleaning products into her coffee. And it wasn't just, you can imagine a child sees you pouring cream into your coffee, and they may have and probably don't have any understanding of what you're doing. And so you could even imagine them there's a bottle of bleach and they're like, oh, I'll put that in mommy's coffee because she likes that. No, Natalia knew what she was doing. In fact, Christine asked her why she did that, and she said that Natalia shrugged and said, I'm trying to poison you, which is, look, one thing you can say about Natalia is she's very straightforward and honest in everything she does.
She's not hiding anything.
No, she is not.
And that's in a lot of ways a lot creepier, right? It's the horror movie scene where the killer slowly walks towards their victim. They feel no urgency to run after them because they know they'll catch them. Like, it's almost like Natalia feels no need to lie about anything because she'll get her way.
And this is all consistent, too, with what Christine is saying about her. She's saying, she's not saying she's evil. She's saying she's a psychopath. She's saying she just has no emotion and no feeling. So this just sort of brutal honesty about the horrible things she's going to do to her parents is kind of consistent with that. And there were other occasions they visited a farm. There was an electric fence to keep the cows in, and Natalia tried to push Christine into the electric fence. Christine said that they would awaken at night to Natalia standing over them in the dark, and that on one occasion she actually had a knife in her hand. And from that point forward, the family felt as though they needed to hide the sharp objects, because if Natalia had a weapon, she was liable to use it. And once again, it's hard to imagine anything more frightening than waking up to someone standing over you in your bed, particularly if they have a knife in their hands. But that's what Christine is saying is happening here. She even begins to question whether Natalia's physical limitations were anywhere near what she claimed. And she suggested that when she wanted to, Natalia could run as well as her other children. She said at one point they went to the beach, and Natalia wanted to be carried to the water with the boys, but the family, they were getting some stuff out of the car, and they told her to wait a second. So she didn't wait to be carried. She just ran to the water. And this was an example to Christine of, she's telling us she can't do these things, but when she really wants to, she will. And Christine even began to wonder, is she even Ukrainian? And she introduced her to a Ukrainian friend, but Natalia couldn't speak any of the language. And in fact, she couldn't remember anything about her country. Now, one thing I'll say about that, I think that's a little unfair. Putting aside everything else that's happening, that seems a little unfair to me. If she's actually a 6-year-old, I don't know that 2 years later she necessarily would remember anything about her home country. And my understanding is that even people who grow up speaking a language, if they are out of that language for a while, it doesn't take long until they will forget their sort of mother tongue or whatever and not be able to speak it. So this one, to me, seems a little less interesting than some of the other things that we've talked about.
Yeah, I think that's right, especially when you're a young child and no, it's not like anyone else has been speaking the language to her other than English. So we see this often, but I think it's more the compounding of all of these events that is really beginning to make Christine nervous and scared about what's actually happening.
And at this point, the family felt like they have to do something. So they take Natalia to some psychiatrists who do some studies on her, who examine her, and they will eventually confirm what the family thought was patently obvious, that Natalia is suffering from some severe mental illnesses, and they're the kind of illnesses that you really don't see in children. These are adult mental illnesses. They're dark, and they are dangerous.
And I mean, based on the things that we've just told you about that Christine is reporting Natalia's doing, I would certainly think that would lead to some sort of diagnosis. This is not typical 6-year-old developmental behavior, and they're incredibly dark thoughts, and it could be something, like a mental issue that could be causing these dark thoughts. But everything we've told you so far, I'm not surprised by that diagnosis, if that's what was reported to the psychiatrist. So, fast forward a couple years. It's June 2012. Christine and Michael had Natalia's legal age changed from 8 at this point. Remember, she was adopted at 6 to 22 years old, adjusting her birth date from September 2003 to September 1989. By the way, I didn't know you could change your birth date, because do people know this? You don't have to go get Botox, just like change your age.
This is really interesting for a couple reasons. Number one, I had no idea you could do this either. I guess the argument that you would have to make is that the documents are fraudulent. I mean, I guess if there was some sort of error, some sort of scrivener's error or whatever, presumably just because the hospital put down the wrong date on your birth certificate, if you could prove that, in fact, that isn't when you were born, you could change that. So, you go to the hospital in 2000, and instead of writing 2000, they write 1900 because they haven't, made the turn yet or whatever. I mean, presumably you wouldn't have to be 100 years old from that point forward. You could get it changed. And this obviously is a little different. I mean, this is basically the family saying, based on everything we've seen, based on everything we've learned, and based on some medical stuff that we're going to talk about as we go through this, we no longer think this is a child. We think that this isn't a case of some sort of psychotic child who's doing all this. This person is an adult, and this has been a fraud, and it's a fraud on the country because she's not even from here, and that, in fact, she is much older than you would think. Now, a couple of things that are striking to me. Even if this is legally possible, I've got to imagine that the standard has to be pretty high. I mean, in civil court, usually it's just a preponderance of the evidence to do anything. You only get beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal court. But I would think, given how significant it is for so many different reasons to change your birth date, I mean, think about it. She's 8 in 2012, according to her birth certificate. She can't be charged with crimes. She can't join the military. She can't vote. She can't open a bank account. She can't buy alcohol. I mean, there's all sorts of things you cannot do when you're 8 years old. But when you're 22, you can do everything, anything. You can be charged as an adult. You can get the death penalty for murder. You can do whatever you want to do. Get married, buy alcohol, whatever.
You can qualify for benefits if we're just talking about like why the government should care, other than, kind of breaking the law and being able to drive and buy alcohol. You can also qualify for certain benefits like unemployment, things like that. And what's most interesting about this age change, and we're not talking about a Scrivener's error, is it implicates a lot of things. Immigration, like, was she just trying to skirt immigration laws, and get citizenship in a fast way? Does it null and void the adoption? But the biggest thing here, when you go from 8 to 22, is an 8-year-old obviously needs to be taken care of. If you don't take care of your 8-year-old child, you can be charged with child neglect or child abuse. But a 22-year-old, totally different story. They are a legal adult, and you don't have any duty as a guardian to provide them food, shelter, money, etc.
And one thing we haven't mentioned, but I mean, we've mentioned some stuff, but How'd they get 1989? Like, even assume that they had reason to believe that she was older than 8. Where'd 1989 come from? And I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't think you'll find the answer to that question if you look into this. There is a feeling by Christine and Michael that Natalia is older than she said she is, and there's some medical information to back that up. But this kind of specificity to move her from 8 to 22, I don't know where they got that from, but one thing we can say is they were able to convince a judge. Whatever evidence they gave to this judge was enough that they took this step, which Alice says benefits you're suddenly available for. Immigration's a big one. If you came to this country under false pretenses, including your age, that can get you deported. And if she's really 22, then she's an adult. And if she's 22 in 2012, then in 2010, she was 20. So even when she came to this country, she would have been an adult. 2 years before that, she was 18. So this is a pretty significant change that they've made, and it is going to have some big ramifications.
So at this point, Christine instructed, she didn't just change, Natalia's legal age. She also instructed Natalia to tell everyone that she was 22 years old, not 8 years old. The family had Natalia committed to an institution, and she was placed in a long-term state psychiatric facility. According to Christine, it was here that Natalia finally confessed that she was, in fact, an adult. In July of 2013, Christine and Michael rent an apartment in Lafayette, Indiana, and furnish it. They move Natalia in, they wish her the best, and eventually they move to Canada without Natalia. Other than paying Natalia's rent, the Bennetts no longer support her or in her life in any way. They signed her up for food stamps and other government support and considered their obligation over and said goodbye to her. And then the twist.
So up to this point, we've been presenting this story as if everything Christine and Michael says is true. That they are seeing these signs that something unusual is going on with Natalia, that they are in a dangerous situation both for themselves and for their family, that they have evidence that Natalia is in fact much older than she says she is, and in fact that she will eventually confess to that. But in 2014, things change. So Natalia meets a couple people, and they don't think that she's 22, even though, or I guess at this point, 24, even though she tells them she's 24, just like she was instructed to do. And they actually inform the police that they think there is a child living on her own in a local rental unit. The police go and speak to Natalia, and she tells them that her parents had abandoned her and moved to Canada. The police listen to her story, and as outlandish as it sounds, they give it some credence. So they go and look at medical records, and they don't see any of this evidence that Christine describes. Far from it. They see repeated confirmation in all the documentation that Natalia was indeed a child. Now, by this point, Michael and Christine have actually divorced, so the police decide to go to speak to Michael. They show up to his house, and he makes a stunning admission. Natalia is a child, and they had known it all along. The whole thing had been a hoax, presumably, so that they would no longer have to take care of Natalia. Now, when the police go to see Christine, she says not so. She maintains to this day that Natalia is an adult psychopath. Both parents were eventually arrested. They were charged with neglect of a dependent, and they are currently awaiting trial. Now, that trial is scheduled to begin pretty soon. So what exactly is the truth in all this? Is Natalia an adult, a psychopath, a would-be murderer? Are they lucky to be away from her? Or was she an innocent child who was taken advantage of and eventually abandoned by the people she should have been able to trust.
This is all so bizarre, especially because remember, we were talking about the legal change of her age earlier. And so what's so interesting about these charges is there's already a legal document out there stating, whether it's correct or not, that Natalia is an adult. And so, the statute, I don't know exactly what's I guess it's Indiana. I don't know what the statute says, but it probably says something about age of the child so that you don't have people being charged with child neglect and abuse if the child's, 45 years old and an adult.
Guys, we have told you before, and if you haven't started listening to the Jordan Harbinger show, I gotta ask you, what are you waiting for? This is one of those podcasts that you're gonna enjoy. It's gonna have good content that changes the way you think about the world. Jordan Show was named one of the best of 2018 by Apple, and it is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker, so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and come to your own conclusions about what's happening around you. If you're listening to this show, you probably like true crime. Jordan has a lot of selections for true crime fanatics. Start with this true crime starter pack. You will not be disappointed. We know that you love good content, and we know you're looking for good content, and you will find it on the Jordan Harbinger show. We really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for the Jordan Harbinger show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to us, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can do right now. Get an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Guys, it is the best time of the year. It's fall. It's a great time to be outside. It's nice and cool, and there are all sorts of activities for you and your family. And Faherty is all about clothing for life's best moments. Whether it's a Friday night football game, the first day of school, or hanging with a family in your backyard this fall, they make clothes that feel good and make you feel good. Recently, my wife and I traveled to Kentucky. It was a little bit cooler than I was used to, so I threw on my Legend sweater, shirt, and Gray Seas plaid, and I was ready to go. I was comfortable, and I looked good at the same time, and that's what you can expect from Faherty. Faherty is a family brand that believes comfort and quality are key. Faherty was founded by 2 twin brothers, Alex and Mike. And Faherty grew out of their longtime love of the surf and mountains, road trips, and beach bonfires. You know the feeling. And if you are looking for clothing that fits those and any other experience you can imagine, Faherty is the answer. You can find a new fall favorite at Faherty. Legendary comfort awaits you. So right now, Faherty is giving all Prosecutors listeners an amazing deal. 20% off on every order. You heard me. You get a full 20% off your order. Head to fahertybrand.com/TP and use code TP at checkout to get this deal. That's code TP at Faherty, FAHERTY, brand.com/TP for 20% off. fahertybrand.com/TP and learn why we love Faherty. I do want to mention that. This was something we were going to discuss at some point. We might as well go and talk about it now. I actually think it's interesting that they're charged with neglect of a dependent, because it might be the case that the age actually doesn't matter. It might be the case that if Natalia is in a certain state, physical state, and the Bennetts had agreed to take care of her, that if they then did not take care of her, even if she's older, then, she's no longer a minor. It might be the case that they are still guilty of something. This is actually something that's pretty interesting. And I kind of dug around a little while in the Indiana statutes and really couldn't figure this out. So I'm interested to see how this case goes. And obviously we will update this after the trial, because it's possible that is sort of a loophole that Indiana has found here, where they're seeing a situation where you have this person who obviously has some physical needs, and these people are supposed to be taking care of her, and they abandon her. And so there might be a little bit of an extension beyond her age that would wrap them up. So that's sort of an interesting question to keep in the back of your mind as you think about this case.
That's a great point, and that's what we call a good fallback, because even if their main theory is that she's a child, if legally they have a document showing that she's an adult, that could fail to meet an element of the crime if age is a necessary element of the crime. But the dependent thing is interesting. We all know situations of this where maybe you take guardianship over a family member who either has a physical ailment or a mental one that requires constant care, and you, for example, leave them alone and never bring them to the doctor, and they're kind of on their own to fend for themselves. That would actually fall under this statute. So what is the truth? Well, let's turn to what we do know, or what's knowable. And one of the things that, it's hard to tell someone's age if they have a severe form of dwarfism, because things like height do not match what is generally on a bell curve for someone of the age. And it can also make the physical appearance of someone look different than you may expect them at a certain age. But there's a bone density test. And according to the Barnetts, they did a bone density test on Natalia and discovered that instead of being 6 when she was adopted, she was actually 14. And by the way, this still doesn't make any sense as to why they changed her age to 22.
Yeah, and even if this is true, you're still a child when you're 14.
Right. And 2 years later is when they changed her age. She would have been 16, still a child. So it's interesting that they said that they did a bone density test, but then they give an age that doesn't explain why they changed the year of her birth to 1989, unless I guess they're Taylor Swift fans for 1989. But here's the thing. There were bone density tests done on Natalia, but according to the evidence gathered by police, they didn't show that Natalia was 14. In fact, a bone density test done in 2010 showed that she was 8, not 6. But it's not that far off. It's only a couple of years. This discrepancy could be related to actual age, or it could be that these tests aren't perfect. And there's the fact that Natalia's genetic disorder causes unusual bone growth. But whatever the answer, it wasn't that Natalia was 14 in 2010. In 2012, another bone density test indicated that she was 11. So were the Barnetts just confused? Because we haven't seen the bone density test that they purport shows Natalia has a bone density of a 14-year-old. But we do have these other 2 tests that show her being a little bit older than she is purported to be, but not far off, just a couple of years. So were the Barnetts just confused, or did they take this slight discrepancy and make it seem much more significant than it was to serve their own purposes?
If you believe the Barnetts did this intentionally, if you believe that the Barnetts made it all up, then at some point there had to be something that inspired this. We don't typically see people just make things up out of whole cloth. People aren't that creative. And, one thing is you did have the movie Orphan, which came out in 2009, and they adopted her in 2010. But the other thing you might have are these tests. And the tests show that she's a little bit older than she was purported to be. And so they take that and they spin it into something else. They take a kernel of truth. The age that she was told to us isn't accurate. And they spin it into, it's not that she's a couple years off. She's 10 years off, or 12 years off, or 16 years off, or whatever it is they end up at. And the thing that's striking to me is, even by their best case scenario, what they tell you, And what they say now is that this bone density thing showed that she was 14 instead of 6. So she's 8 years older than she claimed to be. And assume that's true. As we just said, she would still be a child. Maybe she's not the little girl that you thought you were getting, but she would still be a child, and you would still be her guardian, her legal guardian, and she would still be dependent on you. So there's a couple things that could have happened here. I mean, one possibility is maybe they're telling the truth. Maybe the police just don't have all the records. Maybe this will come out in the trial. Maybe they found out that their 6-year-old is 14 and they didn't like that. They didn't bargain for that. That's not what they wanted. They didn't want a teenager who was going to be an adult in 4 years. They wanted a little girl, and they decided, we don't want a part of this. And maybe they figured there was no way to get out of it just based on the fact she was 14, because once again, she's still a child and she's still dependent on them. And so they spin this bigger story, and it kind of gets out of hand. And at some point they realize, if we're going to get rid of her, we have to make her much older than that. And maybe just pushing her to 18 wasn't enough. They wanted to make it much more significant. So you make her 22, you add in all this other stuff, and then all of a sudden, maybe it makes it look a little bit better for you. Why all the violence? Well, it was true that Natalia had been adopted by some other parents or another family before this family came along, and that didn't work out at all. The children didn't get along. At one point, there was something that happened with one of the brothers, and she fell on him, or she pushed him over, and he hurt his arm. And the family decided, there's just too much going on here. We don't want to deal with this anymore, right? So you could imagine that the Barnetts hear that, and now they've got a bone density test that says she's a little bit older, and they have this prior instance of possible violence, quote unquote violence on her part, and they build the story from there. And that's how you end up in this place where you are saying that an 8-year-old is actually 22.
Yeah, and maybe what's happening is not something that's necessarily even makes the Barnetts bad people, right? We've seen this phenomenon with adopted children, and people say, oh, there's no difference, between my biological children and my adopted children. But did I tell you that I've been through we have not fostered children, but we've been through the certification process to be foster parents. And it's very interesting. They even warn people who are going through this program, who are being trained to be foster parents, who clearly are electing to be there. They want to foster children, that even if you don't want to have any bias towards your own biological children, sometimes in heated moments like injuries or fights among the children, you kind of have to check that internal bias you may have, or lash out or act a little unfairly towards someone who isn't your biological child. And I mean, the fact that they train, potential foster parents on that shows you that this is something that's recognized, and it doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, but it is something that is well documented that it can happen. And so they really may have been protective over their own biological son if he was hurt by Natalia, whether it was intentional or not. I mean, if Natalia is 6 or 8 or even 10, that's a pretty young age, and you can imagine kids hurt each other all the time. That's not, out of the ordinary, but it may have been a particularly stressful time, and it's heightened, and then all of these other things start compounding. Her age is a little off. Well, what if the bone density test is more than a little off? They say it's only 2 years off. What if it's more like 15 years off, because her bone density may be off to begin with because of her dwarfism? So you can kind of see how this may spin out of control, even if there was no ill will to begin with.
So we've mentioned a lot of medical records that the Barnetts have relied on at various times to say that Natalia is actually much older than she says she is. So where are those medical records? If they exist, we haven't seen them. And all we have really is a letter, and the Barnetts show this letter around all the time, from the Barnett family physician that says that Natalia is much older than she says she is. But honestly, it's hard to know whether that is based in any kind of medical examination or any kind of facts, or if it's just based on Christine telling the same stories to this doctor that she has told to us, and the doctor wrote this letter on her behalf. Honestly, wouldn't surprise me. Everybody's got a family physician. They will often do things for the family. I could totally see that happening. I don't put a lot of stock in this. I need something a little bit more concrete than a letter from the family physician. Presumably, if there is evidence out there that exists, we'll see it at trial, though I'm surprised we haven't seen it at this point. The Barnetts have not exactly been shy about talking to the press, and they did so right up until the point where the judge slapped a gag order on everyone involved in the case to prevent this from becoming even more of a media circus than it had already become. But certainly up to the point when the judge did that, they did not provide this evidence, and we have not seen it. Well, what about Michael? So Michael, the most damning thing for Christine and for Michael is Michael's own statement to the police. According to the police, Michael admitted to them that he and Christine knew that Natalia's doctors had determined she was in fact a child, but they left her anyway. And Michael, in these conversations, blamed Christine for this decision. Now, at this point, facing trial, Michael absolutely denies this. In fact, he denies that he made these admissions at all. He says they are the product of a 3-hour interrogation without a lawyer present. I will note that this so-called interrogation apparently happened at Michael's home. I don't know. I mean, you can be coerced into admitting a lot of things, but a 3-hour interrogation is not that long. It takes 45 minutes just to get set up. So I don't know about Michael's decision to retract his prior statements. I kind of think he probably was being pretty honest in those initial statements, but I'm sure at trial he will deny them.
And that's a good point, Brett. You know, when you look at whether a statement is coerced, there's a lot of factors you look at. It's not a science, but one of the factors is kind of your surroundings, the environment. You can imagine if someone is, handcuffed and sitting in a sterile room with two-way glass, and investigators come in and kind of slam their fists on the metal table and say, "You want a bathroom break? Well, first I need some answers." That is a very different environment than leaning back in your couch in your living room in your own home where it's your turf, not law enforcement's turf. So that's not the only factor, but it is very interesting that this statement comes out when he's at his home talking to law enforcement and not, handcuffed and brought into the police station, for example. Now, what about Natalia? She has a voice. She can speak. What is her story? And what does she have to say about all of this? Because true or not, there's a lot going on here, right? Whether she is actually an adult who has homicidal tendencies and is posing as a child, that's an interesting story. Or a child who is moved into an apartment by herself at the age of 8, 9, 10, and to fend for herself is also very interesting. Now, according to Natalia, she is now a 19-year-old woman who never tried to do any of the things that her ex-adopted parents claim she tried to do. Natalia said at first she thought she was in the middle of a dream when the Barnetts showed up. She'd bounced from family to family without a permanent home, and she admitted that one thing the Barnetts said was true. She had thought she'd found a forever family before she met them, but after she hurt one of that family's natural children, they had decided it wasn't worth the problems that come with adoption to keep her. And so that's about that previous kind of failed adoption that she had faced, which is traumatic for anyone, no matter your age. So the Barnetts were a godsend to Natalia when they showed up, and everything seemed to be going fine until she had a surgery related to her medical conditions. Now Natalia lives with the Mann's family. They've said that they also believe Natalia to be 19 and that she has never shown any violent or destructive tendencies while living with them. They really would have liked to have become her guardians when she came to live with them, but they couldn't since she was legally an adult. When they petitioned the court to allow them to become her guardians anyway, the Barnetts did something kind of strange. They filed an objection to this petition by the Manns for them to basically take ownership and care of Natalia. And because the Barnetts filed that objection, the matter was eventually dropped and the Manns never formally became Natalia's guardians.
And this is one of the things, if you watch, so Dr. Phil did an interview with Natalia and the Manns, and it's pretty interesting. It's available on YouTube. Check it out. But one of the things that is frustrating for them is they want to change her age back. and they wanted to be her guardians. But the Barnetts now have a very vested interest in continuing to assert that she is, in fact, an adult because they don't want to go to jail for neglecting a dependent. So they oppose this at every turn, and the courts have been very reluctant to change her age again. And the man's asked a very good question. Why'd you change it in the first place? What evidence did you base that on? Now you're saying there's not enough evidence to change it back to what it was, but you really should do that. And the fact that you're not is just continuing to hurt Natalia. Now I will say this, there has been in sort of the run up to the present, it seems like there is more and more evidence coming out that this is just not true, that Natalia is in fact a child, that she was always a child, that at most she's currently 19 years old, that she's not in her 30s. The police were able to locate another family that had looked into adopting her, and they had a bunch of the original records, which indicated that she was, in fact, a 6-year-old girl when she was adopted in 2010 by the Barnetts. The media was also able to find a woman who purports to be Natalia's mother in Ukraine, and she looks just like her. So I don't know if they have been able to definitively confirm that she is her mother, though I think if they do a DNA test, it will confirm it. And this woman says she remembers the exact day, the exact minute, which isn't that surprising, when Natalia was born, and that she was, in fact, born in 2004 and was 6 years old when she was adopted by the Barnetts. We're obviously going to learn more about this when the trial happens. The trial has been delayed again and again and again, but it is currently scheduled. At least Michael's trial is currently scheduled for October 24th of this year, so in just a couple of weeks when you're listening to this episode. Christine's trial will occur sometime after. They are being tried separately, most likely, as we have discussed on Legal Briefs. There's a lot of brutal issues in this case, a lot of statements by Michael that certainly will be used against him, but can't be used against Christine because he's not going to take the stand, one presumes. So they're going to be tried separately, and we will see what happens. So where does that leave us in this whole crazy case? Well, one thing that we've kind of already mentioned, there are 2 points that I think are very important. The first is, even if Natalia had issues, imagine that the age thing is completely made up or is exaggerated, but imagine everything else happened. Imagine Natalia actually does have mental issues. Imagine that she actually does have psychopathic tendencies. Imagine that she was dangerous to the family. That doesn't mean she should have been abandoned. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Barnetts should have stuck her in an apartment and left her. If she had issues, there were ways to deal with that. And I realize those wouldn't have been easy. And there might have been times when the Barnetts thought, we didn't sign up for this. But the proper course is not to just leave her in the street or even in an apartment that you rented for someone who at best is 14 years old. The proper course would have been to go through authorities and deal with it. That's the first thing. The second thing, as we've said before, even if she was 14, she's still a child and she still needed someone to take care of her. Even if she's older than that, she still has physical disabilities that are going to make it very difficult for her. And like I said, there are certainly states that have neglect of a dependent adult that say that you can't neglect adults. If you look at Indiana's law, like I was saying, it's a little unclear there, to me at least, about whether it applies to adults and children. Be interesting to see how they deal with that. But those are all things that I think are important to remember as well. But one question I'm sure everyone has is, so there were some difficulties here, but they knew when they got her that there were going to be difficulties. They knew that she had physical disabilities, if nothing else. Why would they do this? This seems like a really, really extreme thing to do. Well, if you go all the way back to what we said at the beginning, what is it that made the Barnetts interesting? Well, they have this other child, Jacob, or Jake, and he turns out to be a child prodigy. We mentioned 60 Minutes. When they did the 60 Minutes special on Jacob, if you watch it, there's a scene at the dinner table, and it shows the family with all their kids, and there's Natalia sitting at the dinner table eating. So while Jacob is becoming this sort of child prodigy who is this genius who was going to go off at a very young age, the youngest person ever to attend this whole Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. While he's doing that, that's when Natalia's in the home, and that's when all these problems start to arise. Where was this place that Jacob was going to school, this Perimeter Institute? You may have never heard of it. It's in Canada. And where did the Barnetts move when they left Natalia? Canada. I think what happened here was Natalia was having to have surgeries for the problems that she was dealing with. I think she was too much for the Barnetts to handle, and she was certainly too much to cart off to Canada with them when Christine's writing her book about raising a child genius. I think when they adopted her, everything was fine and it seemed great, but at some point she became baggage, and they decided they were going to get rid of her. That's my theory. To this day, Christine Barnett has never changed her position. In fact, when asked what really occurred in this case, she said, and I quote, "The movie Orphan is exactly what happened."
Whew, I think you're right, Brett. And I mean, we'll see what happens when this trial happens. It's going to be a really interesting trial just because, I mean, the facts of this are so bizarre that I'm sure we'll do a follow-up. But, you know, one thing to know, and of course you can't tell everything based on just these pictures, but if you go look at a picture of what Natalia looks like today, her face clearly looks more mature and different than the photo of when she was adopted, when she was purportedly 6 years old. In 10 years, the difference between being, say, 10 to 20 is a much bigger jump in terms of your physical development and how your face changes, no matter if you have dwarfism or not, versus when you're changing from 30 to 40. Same span of time, different stage in life, your face changes differently. And she really looks like a child in the first one, not just because of her size, but her face. And you compare her face to 12 years later, what she looks like today, and you can imagine that amount of change happening for someone in the age span of 10 to 20, as opposed to from 20 to 30 or 30 to 40. So, I mean, that's not a scientific thing, but, she's given interviews, she's out there talking, and the interesting thing with this is why do this? And I think, Brett, you identified a really interesting motive here. And we'll see what the prosecution does and how much they flesh out that motive here and how much the judge allows in. I think he will allow it in because it's, of course, showing motive and kind of explaining this bizarre fact pattern. But, this is how powerful clickbait is. I totally heard this story before. I 100% only heard the side that she was, in fact, a 22-year-old woman who had homicidal tendencies and, would show up and stand over her adopted parents with a knife. That's all I knew of. I never even knew that there was then later an allegation of neglect or that there was a trial upcoming. So, yeah, thank you guys for, making us look into this so that we can find out the real stories on these things. But this is happening in real time. We'll see what happens and we'll update you.
Yeah, and two things on that. First, as you were saying about her changing, one of Christine's arguments when this all started was she never grew an inch and she didn't change at all. And how could that be the case if she's really 6? Well, she has changed now. I mean, if you look at pictures of her now versus pictures of her when she was adopted, she is very clearly someone who's grown up, and she looks very different now. And to me, there's no question here. Did the Barnetts know that she was really a child? Did they actually believe the story they told? Maybe. And maybe that'll come out in trial. But I think there is no question in my mind that she was a child when she was adopted by them. Maybe she was 8 and not 6. Maybe she was 10 and not 6. But she was a child, and she was abandoned by them as a child. They might not have known that, but that's what happened. And the other thing is, you're 100% right. It's something to always remember. People go after true crime sometimes because, it exploits victims or whatever. And I think what people need to realize is all of the media exploits people. All of it. True crime is just a part of it. And it doesn't matter what it is capable of exploiting people. And you saw that happen in this case where this girl, this young girl, this innocent girl, in my opinion, was completely exploited for clickbait, for YouTube videos that made it seem like this is horror in real life. And the same as you, every time I heard this story, I heard it as if it were true. And when we looked into this to do this, I was surprised that there was all this other information out there. And as I've said before, people want to attack true crime podcasts, but true crime podcasts are much better at getting to the truth than a lot of the media, because a lot of times you hear and learn things that go much deeper than a clickbait headline. And I just hope that after all this is said and done, Natalia can move on with her life, and that she can leave this behind and go on to have a long and fulfilling life. Well, that's all we have today on this show. If you have thoughts, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Check us out on YouTube. Join the gallery on Facebook or our subreddit on Reddit. Love to hear what you guys think. Love all the conversation that goes on there, and love all the suggestions you guys give us for new stories. More and more of the episodes we do are based on what you want to hear and not so much on what we always thought we would cover, so keep them coming. Alice, do you have anything else before we sign off?
No, but, when we started this, we talked about how I didn't think this was as creepy as our regular October stories, and Brett was like, no, this is way creepier. So you see, it's in the eye of the beholder.
In the eye of the beholder. It absolutely is. You guys can let us know what you thought about the creepiness factor of this case. But we will be back next week with another creepy story. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
An October case.
It is definitely an October case.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is not nearly as creepy. I appreciate it.
I see this one. I mean, were it not for the fact that it seems like it's not true, to me, this is way creepier than some of the other ones. You never know, though.
You never know.
You never know when a horror movie might walk right into your life, Alice.
That's right.
Could happen tonight.
Suffered from a severe form of dwarfism known as, oh man. Okay.
I made sure that you had to read this part.
I know you had to. I know you did. Okay, wait, let me try this. Spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. Spondyloepiphyseal. Oh, I got it.
All this month, celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month with Pluto TV. Watch movies like Compadres and the Spy Kids trilogy, or your favorite stars like Luis Gerardo Mendez in Camino a Marte. Plus, Pluto TV has thousands more movies and TV shows and over 45 channels in Spanish, all for free. So download the Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming today. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.